Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and welcome to another indie book review. I am so excited because I have been getting a lot of high fantasy and super sci-fi in my inbox lately, and it's fantastic. This one I've actually had for a hot minute. I've had it since before I was closed to review requests, but like I say, I'm not a first come, first serve type of girl, but I did really enjoy this one. At least, well, we'll get to that. And that is for A Footstep Echo by JD Sanderson. This is a time travel mystery all about a man who kind of stumbles across this woman who seems to be in peril. She doesn't remember who she is. She can't really speak all that well, but she can time travel real good, and ends up taking him with her, and he doesn't know who she is or why she can time travel or what time period she's from. And I loved this concept. And then when I started reading, I didn't realize, I don't think the synopsis really says it, but our main character Bernard is actually an elderly man, like in his 70s, and I loved that. We don't have enough like elderly protagonists in stories unless it's like, some contemporary family saga with all the sentimentality. Like, no, this is a straight sci-fi time travel weird running away from things and bad guys, but with an elderly protagonist, and I loved that aspect. In fact, I loved the first half of the book a ton, and the mystery and the not knowing and the where did she come from and where does this tech come from and why is she going to all these different places and taking him with her and she's disappearing, where is she off to. That was awesome. I love that. I love Bernard. He's like the perfect like cute old man that calls each other like sweetheart, and back in my day. And I realized that like time travel and elderly characters go really well together, because like they would travel back to like the 90s and he'd be like, oh, I remember this is where my wife and I, and like they would go back 20 years and he wasn't phased because he already lived through 20 years ago. And I loved that aspect. He was so cute, such a fantastic main character. And the first half was fantastic. And then the reveal of who the woman was also fantastic. I didn't see it coming, and it fit in, well, really well. It was definitely, it was so awesome. The problem came in the second half, and that's what was really disappointing to me, because I adored the first half so much, and the second half kind of lost it. Now, obviously, because there's this big plot reveal of our mystery woman's identity, and I can't get into the specifics of what it was in the second half that kind of gave me pause, so I'll speak as vaguely as I can. And one of the biggest things that I kind of struggled with in the second half was Bernard doesn't seem to have as much of a place in the second half of the story. In the first half, he's the woman's essentially only friend and helping her, and she doesn't have another friend in the world, and so it makes sense. And the second half, his part isn't as important, and it feels like the narrative contrived really hard to bring him back into it, but it was never as believable as his interactions in the first half. And you can kind of tell the author figured that out, because at a certain point in the second half, the focus shifts to some other point of views and some other characters that, in theory, could have been a lot of fun. There is a group of scientists, and I can't really explain to you what their purpose is in the story because, again, spoilers, but I get the feeling that you were supposed to get a found family aspect from it, certain characters dating other characters, and these characters have worked together for so long, and they're all friends, and I get the feeling that you're supposed to feel that found family-ness. The problem is, because they weren't focused on until the second half of the story, it didn't come across as authentic because you only had half a book to make it work. And this is a fairly short book. I think entirety it's like 220 pages. So when you have a book that is that short, it's really hard to make an entire group of people not only feel authentic, but also the relationships enough so that you feel that it is a found family. But the relationships I did really like were actually Bernard and another character in his own time, and that was a really cute relationship. And again, I'm trying not to spoil. The other thing that the second half kind of struggled with me is the second half focuses more on the future the time travel in here is basically they're from the future, but they can't go beyond it, so you can only go so far in the future. But I guess it's not really a pet peeve. It's just not something I'm super into. It has that aspect where the future is like perfect, more or less. Like another character was explaining the future to Bernard, because of course they have to. That's how you explain it to the reader. And he was talking about how like they have like what is essentially like total global peace, and like the entire world operates under one unified government, and they now grow their own meat, so there's no more meat eating at all, and there's all these animal sanctuaries for farm animals, and all of these diseases are destroyed. And there was one point where a doctor talks about how he's literally never had to repair a heart attack because they don't happen anymore. Like that kind of like ultra utopian. I'm not the biggest fan of that idea that like all of history is leading towards one fantastic utopian place. I don't really go with it. Like they had like perfect ecological, like perfectly sustainable, like perfect everything. And I think the year was supposed to be, I think it was supposed to be the 23rd century. So 2020, 22, whatever. And it's whatever. As someone who studied history, which I know feels like the opposite of time traveling to the future, there is a lot of people that has this idea of all of the time that we've been on the earth magically moving us forward to this utopian time. And as someone who studied history, I can tell you that that doesn't really happen. History ebbs and flows, and we go forward and backward. Like, the Middle East was once much more progressive than they are now. They actually turned more conservative in previous years and more towards violence than they were in like the 70s and 80s. So time isn't this linear thing where we're all automatically moving towards this utopian future, but a lot of time travel books tend to portray it like that. And it's not specifically a pet peeve. There were still problems in the future world. There was still like badness and bad things happening. And so there was some tension and conflict and fear and all of that, but more or less it's like, oh yes, there's this one bad thing, but the rest of the world is perfect. And that was whatever. And so like I said, the problem with this book was the first half, loved it, fantastic. Second half, started losing it for me. And there was also, okay, how do I say this without getting too spoilery? There was an antagonisty type thing in the first half that I thought was going to be a much bigger problem than it ended up being. Is that vague enough? But no, there was this big thing. I was like, oh, what's this problem, conflict that we must muster? And then it didn't really coalesce into anything at the end mark. And I don't know if that was supposed to have been explained away. I don't remember an explanation off the top of my head, but I have been reading a lot of books lately, so I might just need to start reviewing books closer to the time I read them. But in general, the premise started out fantastic. Great first half. I love that we have an elderly protagonist in a sci-fi book. I want more. I want elderly protagonists of space operas. I want elderly protagonists of military sci-fi. Like, I want more. I don't know how you fit an elderly protagonist in military sci-fi, but you can make it work. Anyway, I genuinely did enjoy this book. However, because the second half did not live up to what I was hoping, and it was a whole half, I gave this book 3 stars. However, the concepts were intriguing enough that I would probably read something else that JD Sanderson wrote. I love sci-fi. I love that I keep getting it. And it was just very different than everything else, and I'm happy with it. Oh, and GM Nair, who said he was about to throw down with another indie author who was encroaching in on his time travel mystery gambit. You don't need to worry. It's very different from that one. If you've watched my review on Duncan and Dyer Dicks for Hire by GM Nair, it is another indie sci-fi time travel mystery. Wholly different. This one is much more earnest then the other one's very satirical take. So these are two different. GM Nair, you don't need to fight to the death with JD Sanderson. I promise I am not here to referee any duels to death. Now, if you are an indie author and you would like an indie review, please email me. I will have my email down in the description below, as well as my indie review policy. Please read that before you send the email. It answers a lot of questions and saves us a ton of time. But with nothing else to say, I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.